The land hadn't changed. The hills still rolled like waves turned to stone. The fences still creaked in the wind, and the morning sun still painted the porch in honey-gold light. But the chair beside Joanna Callahan sat empty now. It had been 6 months since they put Thomas in the ground. 6 months since she'd held his calloused hand, whispered her last goodbye, and watched the only man she'd ever trusted fade into the earth he'd loved. Now it was just her, and 312 acres of dry grass, stubborn cattle, and a mortgage breathing down her neck like a drunk with bad intentions. But she stayed, not because it was easy, because it was hers. Joanna wiped the sweat from her brow as she hammered the loose gatepost for the 3rd time that week. Her dress was dusty, her boots were cracked, and her hands looked more like a ranch hand's than a widow's. And yet she stood straight. She worked alone, and she didn't ask for favors. That was why, when the riders came over the hill that afternoon, she didn't run. She didn't hide. She just rested her hand on the shotgun that leaned by the porch rail. There were 4 of them, men she didn't know, too clean for cow hands, too quiet for good intentions. The one in front wore a white shirt with silver cufflinks, like he'd just walked out of a banker's office and onto her dirt. He smiled, the kind of smile that made the air colder. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, tipping his hat. "A pleasure." She narrowed her eyes. "That's Miss Callahan now," he chuckled. "Forgive me, I'm Everett Harlan, representing the interests of Silver Rock Holdings." Joanna said nothing. Everett gestured toward the barn. "You've got a fine piece of land here, water access, decent grazing, no real protection." Joanna's grip on the porch rail tightened. "We're prepared to offer you cash, generous terms, enough to start over, somewhere easier." She looked him dead in the eye. "If I wanted easier, I wouldn't still be standing here." The man's smile faltered for a blink, then returned, cooler, sharper. "Don't be foolish, ma'am. This land doesn't belong to a memory, and it doesn't have to break you." Joanna's voice came low and firm. "It already tried. I'm still here." The riders didn't push further, not that day. But as they turned and rode off, Everett Harlan left behind something worse than threat. A promise. That night, Joanna sat on the porch, shotgun across her knees, listening to the coyotes howl and the wind rattle her shutters. She wasn't scared. She was furious, because she hadn't fought this hard to bury her husband just to watch strangers dig up his land. They thought she was just a widow. They had no idea what she was about to become. 2 days passed. Joanna didn't see the riders again, but she knew better than to believe they were gone. Men like Everett Harlan didn't vanish. They lingered, circled, waited for women to blink. And she wasn't going to blink. She spent her mornings checking the perimeter of the ranch, her rifle slung across her shoulder, her boots sinking into familiar dust. The fence was holding, but barely. The wire was rusted, the posts splitting. She patched what she could, cursing under her breath when the hammer missed the nail. At midday, she led the old mule, Buckley, down to the stream. He was stubborn and slower than sin, but he listened to her voice and didn't need a whip. That was more than she could say for most men she'd met in town. By sundown, she was back on the porch, sore but steady, notebook open across her lap. She was writing down costs, fencing, seed, nails, feed. The numbers didn't lie. The ranch needed more than she had, but giving it up? Not on her life, not on Tom's memory. That night, she didn't sleep much. A loose shutter banged in the wind, and every time it did, her hand jumped toward the rifle beside her bed. The next morning, something changed. She heard hammering. But it wasn't her. Joanna slipped on her boots, grabbed the rifle, and stepped outside, heart steady, jaw tight. Near the south pasture, by the fence she hadn't touched yet, stood a man she didn't recognize. Broad shoulders, straw hat, shirt rolled at the sleeves, he was pounding a fresh post into the dry earth like he belonged there. She kept the rifle raised, but didn't aim. Not yet. "You've got 10 seconds to tell me why you're on my land," she called. The man turned. He was in his 30s, maybe a few years older than she was. Sun-browned skin, deep-set eyes, and a calmness that didn't feel forced. He tipped his hat. "Name's Colt McAllister. Sheriff sent me, said you needed help." Joanna lowered the rifle a fraction. "I didn't ask for help," he nodded. "Didn't say you did. Just said you had riders sniffing around who don't like hearing no. Figured I'd come lend a hand. Or a hammer." Joanna studied him. He didn't talk like a drifter. Didn't carry himself like someone trying to win favor. He was just there. "You're not from around here," she said. He smiled slightly. "That obvious?" She didn't smile back, but she didn't raise the rifle either. "You got a place to stay?" He shrugged. "I'll camp near the barn. Got my own gear." Joanna hesitated, then turned and walked back toward the house. "You break anything?" she called over her shoulder. "You fix it twice." Colt laughed. "Fair enough." That evening, she watched him from the porch as he drove 2 more posts and coiled wire like he'd done it his whole life. He didn't talk much, didn't ask questions, just worked. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel quite so outnumbered. Not because he was strong, not because he was skilled, because he didn't treat her like a widow. He treated her like someone worth standing beside. The morning sun spilled over the hills like a promise, and Joanna was already outside, pitchfork in hand, stacking hay for the last 2 cows that hadn't been stolen by drought or debt. She'd grown used to the silence of working alone. Until now. Because Colt McAllister was already in the barn, fixing a hinge. Without being asked, Joanna watched him from the doorway, arms crossed. He hadn't said much the day before, just enough to explain he'd come on word from Sheriff Avery, who'd known her late husband and still respected Joanna's grit. Still, she didn't like surprises. "You always start your mornings on other folks' property?" she asked. Colt looked up, not startled, not defensive, just steady. "Only when they've got a barn door that's hanging on by one nail." Joanna narrowed her eyes, then turned back to the yard. "You don't have to impress me, McAllister." He grabbed his hat, dusted it off. "I wouldn't dare try!" She didn't know if that was sarcasm or sincerity. She liked that she couldn't quite tell. Later, they rode the fence line together. She rode Tom's old horse, and Colt took the mule, which she found amusing, until he managed to get the stubborn creature to follow commands she'd given up trying years ago. "He listens to you," she said as they checked the west gate. "Mules respect patience," Colt replied, "and being left alone when they're grumpy." "Sounds like someone I know," Joanna muttered. Colt grinned. "If you're comparing yourself to a mule, ma'am, I'm not stepping in that trap." She gave a small laugh. Just once, but it was the first sound like it in weeks. That night, after feeding the animals and boiling coffee on the stove, Joanna poured a second mug without thinking and brought it out to the porch. Colt sat on the top step, hat in his lap. "You planning to stay long?" she asked, handing him the mug. He took it with a quiet nod. "Only as long as I'm useful." "And when I don't need you anymore?" He looked out over the field. "Then I'll go." Joanna didn't answer, because for the first time in a long while, someone had shown up without asking for anything. No sympathy, no money, no explanation. Just a pair of hands, a calm voice, a presence that didn't push. And as the stars came out one by one, painting the sky in silence, she realized something she hadn't dared feel in months. She didn't mind the company, and that in itself was dangerous. The sky cracked open just before dawn. Joanna sat up in bed to the sound of rain hitting the tin roof like 1,000 quiet footsteps. It hadn't rained in weeks. The soil had been dry, the air brittle. But now the storm was here, heavy, cleansing, and sudden. She threw on her coat and boots and rushed outside. The chickens needed covering. The cellar door always blew loose in wind like this. But before she could cross the yard, she saw Colt, already out there, shirt soaked, hauling a tarp over the stacked feed near the barn. He looked over his shoulder as she approached. "You always wake up early in the rain?" he asked. She shouted over the downpour, "Only when it ruins half my storage!" He grinned and handed her one side of the tarp. Together, they fought the wind like it owed them something, then secured the ropes with knots that held. Once the work was done, both stood under the small awning outside the barn, catching their breath, soaked to the bone but too stubborn to complain. Joanna looked out at the pasture. "Tom used to say rain on a Sunday meant God hadn't forgotten this land." Colt glanced at her, his voice gentler now. "You talk about him a lot." Joanna shrugged, brushing wet hair from her face. "He was the only one who ever stayed." A silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Then she added quietly, "Until you." Colt didn't look away. His tone was steady, no rush, no weight. "I'm not here to replace anything, Joanna. Just to hold the line while you figure out what comes next." She stared at him. This man who wasn't flashy, who hadn't made promises, who hadn't tried to save her, the way some men had tried when they realized she was alone. Colt just showed up. Fixed things, fed things, listened, stayed. It was strange how that made her chest ache more than all the grief in the world. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted. "Then let's just fix fence posts till you do." Later that afternoon, the rain cleared. Colt repaired the latch on the chicken coop. Joanna baked cornbread with the last of her flour. When she brought a plate out to the porch, she found him sharpening an old blade, one she recognized. "That was Tom's knife," she said. Colt looked up. "I found it near the back fence. Looked like someone tossed it." Joanna's face darkened. "That's not where we left it." Colt nodded once. "Thought you'd say that." Something tightened between them. An understanding. Someone had been there. And they hadn't just come to look around. They'd come to test the boundary. That night, Colt loaded his rifle and leaned it beside the front door. Joanna didn't stop him, because she'd just remembered that her land wasn't just worth fighting for. It was worth defending together. 2 nights later, the quiet broke. Joanna heard it first. The sharp crack of wood splintering near the back corral. Not the wind, not a horse kicking the rails, something intentional. She was on her feet in seconds. Colt was already at the door, rifle in hand. He looked at her once, no words needed, then stepped into the darkness. Joanna followed, shotgun under her arm, heart thudding like hooves across hard ground. The sky was cloudy, the moon veiled, but they didn't need light to know their own land. They found the gate open. "Not blown, Pride!" And near the fence line, a man stood. Coat too clean for a ranch hand, boots too polished for a neighbor. Everett Harlan. Back again? But this time, he wasn't smiling. "Evening," he said coolly, hands raised but empty. "Just taking a look. Didn't mean to spook the livestock." Colt stepped forward, rifle aimed low but steady. You're not here for livestock. Harlan tilted his head, eyes gleaming under his brim. That's true. Then he looked at Joanna. You've had time to think, Miss Callahan. Last time we came with cash. Next time it won't be as kind. Joanna's voice was iron. You stepped onto my land in the dark. That's not business. That's trespassing. Harlan chuckled. Funny how fast a widow learns to talk tough. Colt took another step forward, and for a brief moment, the edge in his voice could have split wood. She's not alone, not anymore. Harlan's eyes flicked toward Colt's rifle. He didn't move, just breathed in slow and deep, like weighing something. Then he smiled, cold, final. We'll see how long that lasts. He turned, walked to his horse, and disappeared into the trees. Back at the house, Joanna paced the floor, hands trembling though her voice hadn't cracked once. Colt leaned the rifle beside the door and watched her. He'll be back, she said. They all come back. Colt nodded. Then we'll be ready. She stopped pacing. You don't have to stay. He looked at her, hard and steady. I know. A long silence settled between them. Then Joanna walked to the porch, the wind lifting the hem of her worn skirt, and stared out into the night. After a moment, she said softly, without turning, He thinks I'm just a widow, that I'll fold. Colt stepped beside her. He's wrong. She glanced at him. How do you know? He looked out across the hills where the grass swayed and the shadows ran deep. Because I've never seen someone fix a fence like it was a prayer. Joanna let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. And in the silence that followed, something new settled over the porch. Not fear, but resolve. The next morning, Joanna rode into town. She hadn't planned to, hadn't wanted to. But after what happened the night before, she needed to know exactly what Harlan's men were after. Not guesses, not threats. Facts. Colt offered to ride with her, but she said no. She needed to do this as Joanna Callahan, not with someone standing at her side. Not yet. The town hadn't changed much since Tom died. Same chipped paint on the mercantile's door. Same wind that rattled loose signs. Same stares from people who didn't know whether to offer condolences or pretend she wasn't there. She tied her horse and walked straight into the land office. Morning, Miss Callahan, said old Mr. Beck, pushing his spectacles up his nose. I hear you've had visitors. She didn't sit. I need to see my deed, he blinked. Your husband handled most of that. He's dead. I'm not. Show me the papers. Mr. Beck nodded, hobbled to the back, and returned with a bundle of records tied in twine. Joanna opened them at the counter, scanning for signatures, conditions, ownership lines. And there it was. A clause Tom had added 3 years ago, handwritten, buried near the back. In the event of my passing, ownership and all decisions pertaining to the Callahan Ranch fall to Joanna Callahan, sole legal heir and title holder. Her name, her land, clear as day. She exhaled, but then Beck cleared his throat. There's been a filing, quiet one. Came in 2 weeks ago. A claim submitted by Everett Harlan. Says the property is in default on back taxes. Joanna's stomach dropped. It's not. Beck raised his hands. It shouldn't be. But if someone paid the assessor to move dates or bury notices, it could slip through the cracks until it's too late. Joanna stepped back. Harlan wasn't just threatening her. He was trying to erase her, by pen and paper, not just force. Beck looked at her with something close to respect. You've got 10 days before the review hearing, that's all. Joanna nodded, jaw tight. She stepped into the sun, hands shaking, dust rising around her boots. And when she mounted her horse, she didn't look like a widow anymore. She looked like a woman heading to war. Back at the ranch, Colt was chopping wood when she returned. He saw her face and stopped mid-swing. Bad news? She tossed him the paper. He read it, slow and quiet, then folded it once. So they're not just after the land. Joanna looked at him. They're after my name, my rights, everything Tom and I ever built. Colt leaned on the axe. You want to fight this legal? She nodded. I wanted to fight this right. Then you'll need help. Joanna narrowed her eyes. You offering again? Colt's voice was calm as always. Not offering, committing. She studied him for a moment, and finally she said, All right, let's give them a reason to regret thinking I'd give up quietly. Because if they were going to try to bury her, she'd make sure they choked on the dust. For the next 3 days, the ranch roared with motion. Colt repaired what fences he could, using every spare board and spool of wire they had left. Joanna worked just as hard, fixing the barn roof, boiling jars of preserves from what little she'd stored, making lists of people she could trust. That list was short. Very short. But it included Sheriff Avery, who came out on the second day with a grim look and a folded paper. I heard what Everett's trying to pull, he said, handing Joanna a worn notice. He's petitioned to move the court hearing up. 5 days. Joanna cursed under her breath. Colt looked to the sheriff. And there's nothing to stop it? Avery shook his head. Not unless you can prove the taxes were falsified and that someone inside the office is working with him. And for that, you need more than suspicion. You need a witness. Joanna stared off across the fields. Then I need someone brave enough to speak up. That afternoon, Joanna rode out alone. To Helen Brewer's ranch, a neighbor widow, tough as leather, who'd once been cheated out of grazing rights by Harlan's company. She had nothing left but a goat and her pride. Joanna explained everything. The deed, the false tax claim, the pressure, the silence. Helen sat in her rocking chair, listening, one hand clenched around her cup of weak tea. When Joanna finished, Helen didn't answer right away. But finally, she stood, walked to the cabinet, and pulled out a thin journal with a faded red ribbon. I kept records, she said. Phone calls, dates, men who showed up with papers that didn't make sense. I didn't have anyone to fight for me back then. She turned. But you do, and I won't let them do to you what they did to me. Joanna returned just after dark, Helen's journal tucked in her satchel. Colt met her at the gate, lantern in hand. She handed him the satchel without a word. He opened it, saw the journal, and nodded once. That's enough to make them nervous. Joanna's voice was low. Good. Let them feel a little fear for once. Then she looked up at him, eyes fierce and shining. Thank you for staying. Colt tilted his head. Wasn't going anywhere. Even if this ends badly? He stepped closer, voice steady. Especially then. For a moment, the weight of everything hung between them. Land, legacy, loss. But underneath it, something else had begun to grow. Not just loyalty, belief. And when Colt gently touched her shoulder before walking back to the barn, Joanna didn't flinch, because somewhere between heartbreak and threat, she'd found something she hadn't dared hope for. A partner. The hearing was just 3 days away, and the pressure pressed down on Joanna like a coming storm. Colt sharpened blades in the barn and kept the rifle clean, but even he could feel the tension building. Not just in her shoulders or her words, but in the air itself. Every stranger on horseback that passed near the property slowed down to look. Every fence post left standing felt like a message. Still here. But for how long? That morning, Joanna rode into town with the journal in hand and fire in her gut. She walked straight into the sheriff's office and laid Helen Brewer's notebook on the desk. Sheriff Avery flipped through the pages, eyes scanning entries that named dates, documents, and even the names of 2 men tied to Harlan's shady dealings. One of them, the tax clerk himself. The sheriff looked up. This is enough to open an inquiry. Joanna crossed her arms. Good. I'm not leaving the courtroom until that man is off my land. Meanwhile, Colt stayed behind at the ranch, and it's a good thing he did. Around noon, he spotted smoke rising from the west fence line. Not a lot. Just enough. Enough to know someone had started a fire. He grabbed a shovel and sprinted. By the time he got there, the flames were licking up dry grass, dancing in the wind. They hadn't reached the barn or house yet, but they would. Colt moved like lightning, beating the fire back one swing at a time. He threw up dirt, kicked wet sacks across burning patches, and shouted for Buckley the mule, who, to his credit, dragged a water barrel close enough for Colt to douse the fence line. By the time Joanna returned breathless from the ride, Colt's arms were blackened with soot and sweat. The fire was out. But the message was clear. This wasn't about money anymore. It was war. She dropped to her knees beside him. Are you hurt? Colt shook his head. Just burned at both ends. Joanna looked at the scorched earth and the charred fence posts. Then she stood, fists clenched. They want to scare me, break me. Colt met her gaze. It's not working. And she knew it was true. Because they could burn the fences. They could file crooked claims. But they couldn't touch what had rooted in her heart. Not anymore. That night, she sat beside Colt on the porch. The stars above were quiet, and the air still smelled of smoke. But there was no fear in her bones, just focus. Joanna turned to him, her voice low. You asked me what I want to do when this is over. He nodded. She looked out at the field. I want to keep building, not just fences, a life, a future. Colt leaned forward, hands resting between his knees. You thinking of doing that alone? Joanna smiled. Not soft. Steady. I was, but now I know better. The morning of the hearing, Joanna wore black. Not for mourning. For memory. For strength. For the part of herself that had buried a husband, held a shotgun at her door, and outlasted both silence and fire. Colt stood beside her outside the courthouse, quiet as ever. He didn't try to speak courage into her. She didn't need it. His presence was enough. You sure you want me in there? He asked, adjusting the collar of his only clean shirt. Joanna looked at him with a calm fierceness. You've stood with me this far. You think I'm going to walk in there alone? He tipped his hat. Didn't figure. Inside, the courthouse was small. 1 room, 3 pews, a single judge whose boots scraped the floor more than the gavel hit it. Everett Harlan sat smugly on the other side of the room, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked like they belonged in a city bank, not a dusty frontier town. The judge called the hearing to order. Miss Callahan, you're contesting a land forfeiture due to tax default. Your defense? Joanna stood. She spoke clearly, strongly, no apologies in her voice. The claim was filed using false records. I have proof that the taxes were paid and that Mr. Harlan used manipulation and bribery to accelerate this filing. She handed over Helen Brewer's journal. The judge raised an eyebrow. And this is the record of another widow Harlan tried to rob. She documented every call, every visit, every lie. The judge flipped through it, reading silently. Then came the sound of a throat clearing. Everett Harlan stood. Now, that woman isn't a legal authority, it's hearsay. Scribbled notes from someone with a grudge. Joanna stared straight at him. You can call it scribbles, I call it survival. The judge looked over his glasses. And the tax clerk mentioned here, Sheriff Avery stepped forward from the back of the room. Already in custody, admitted to altering records in exchange for payment. The room fell silent. Everett's face paled. Colt smiled, just a little. The judge tapped the gavel. Claim is dismissed. Land remains with Miss Joanna Callahan, permanently and without further contest. A murmur rose in the courtroom. Joanna exhaled for the first time in hours. As Everett was escorted out, he turned back toward her, eyes narrowed. But Joanna didn't flinch. She didn't have to. She'd already won. Not just the land. Her name, her place, her power. Back at the ranch that night, Colt uncorked a bottle of cider they'd been saving since before Tom died. They drank from tin cups on the porch, the stars bright overhead. Joanna leaned back in her chair, boots up, shoulders finally light. You stayed, she said softly. Colt looked at her. You fought, she nodded. For the ranch, for myself. Then, after a pause, and maybe for something more. Colt didn't rush her, just waited. Joanna turned to him. You still planning on riding out someday? He shook his head. Not if I've got something worth staying for. She didn't answer with words. She just reached for his hand. And in that small gesture, something larger was built than any fence or courtroom when... A beginning. Weeks passed. The air turned warmer, the grass greener, and for the first time in a long while, the Callahan Ranch didn't feel like a battlefield, it felt like home. Joanna stood by the gate one morning, watching the sun rise over her land. Not just Tom's land, not just soil and debt and inheritance, her land, earned, defended, and claimed with both grit and grace. Colt joined her, coffee in hand, sleeves rolled. He didn't say much as usual. But when he handed her a small bundle wrapped in canvas, she raised an eyebrow. What's this? She asked. Something I've been working on. She unwrapped it. It was a wooden sign, hand-carved, smooth with effort and care. The letters were burned in deep. Callahan Ranch & Co., built in love, protected with fire, rebuilt in faith. Her breath caught. She looked at him. You really think it needs more than just my name? He met her gaze, steady. I think it already has more. And if you want me here, not just helping but staying, I'd like to build something that's ours. Joanna traced her fingers over the words. The edges weren't perfect, but the message was. She nodded once, then smiled. Not just with her lips, but with the part of her that hadn't smiled in years. Hang it by the gate, she said. Later that afternoon, with the help of old Buckley and 2 crooked nails, they lifted the new sign over the entrance. The same gate that had once welcomed Tom home, the same gate she had almost lost. Now it held a new name, not just of survival, but of partnership. That evening, as they shared supper under the wide sky, Joanna leaned her head gently against Colt's shoulder. You know, they thought I was just a widow, Colt chuckled. They were wrong. She smiled, closing her eyes. They had no idea who they were waking up. He raised his cup. To second chances. Joanna lifted hers. And to never letting go again. As the stars blinked to life above them, quiet and unbothered, the wind swept across the fields, not as a warning, but a blessing. And on the porch of the Callahan Ranch in Compey, 2 people who hadn't been looking for love found something better. A place where love could grow, because it had already been forged in fire.